All right, good evening. Good evening. Thanks for joining me once again for tonight's meeting for the East Lansing Study Committee on Independent Police Oversight Commission meeting, 6 p.m., February 8th, 2021. Thanks for joining me. We will be doing our thing, making recommendations for a police oversight that we're creating and whatnot. And we'll be hearing from an attorney tonight, a labor attorney. They're going to give us the one-on-one on some of the different things that oversight can possibly weigh in on down the road when it comes to accountability and overall transparency with information and releasing documents pending internal investigations by police. And once the investigation is completed, just kind of wading through that stuff. So we'll have that person come in. Then we'll also be talking about the actual model, as I was saying, I think previous meeting, and kind of really what the oversight will be doing as a function within the commission. So stay tuned. We're about 5 minutes away. So hang tight with me on the dead airspace. And again, thanks for joining. Good evening.
Hello. Gouri.
Welcome.
Nice to meet you.
You as well. How do you pronounce your name?
Gouri.
Gouri. And your last name?
Sashital.
Sashital. Thank you. I'm Chuck Grigsby. I'm the chair of the commission here, and it's up to you. I always tell our guests that if you want to stay on camera until it's your portion of the time, please feel free to do that. But if you don't have to, you can turn off your camera, and then Diane or Justin will prompt you to come with us if you do turn off the camera. So no worries.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for joining us this evening.
Good morning. Oh my gosh. Good evening. Oh, look at it. Oh, brother.
Wow.
Good to see everyone.
You as well.
Hello, sir. Hi, Lane. Hello, Lane. Hello, Steve.
Hello, I have my mic off because I have two little boys in the background wrestling.
I remember those days. They do go out of it.
You know, there's a 5-year age difference.
Mine were 3.
And for whatever reason, the 5-year-old always is instigating these battles. And it's funny because he's stocky and solid. The 2-year-old is tall and lean, and it's kind of funny sometimes, but it does get loud.
Okay.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hey, Kelly. Good. How are you guys?
Hang in. Winter's not my favorite.
Well, we've gotten past the shortest day of the year.
Good
It's
point.
light out at 6 o'clock.
You know, that Justin was saying earlier, too. It's pretty great. Kathy, you came back. Thank you.
Don't see any double bookings tonight, so we shouldn't get kicked off at the beginning of this meeting.
That's good for you, isn't it?
Oh, yes, it is.
Boy, you had to really work last time.
You know, normally it's spaced over the course of a couple hours. There's quite a bit of setup, and to try to cram that into 15 minutes or 5 minutes as quickly as possible.
You were trying to do it instantly.
Oh, I
You
would like
did.
to not repeat that.
You did a fabulous job.
Well, thank you.
Well, and no one sees you sweat.
That's the benefit of Zoom, is that it can be calm up here, but you know, it's like a duck on the water, right?
So waiting on Collins, Sharon, and Eric.
Thank you.
That's fine.
All right. Chuck, are you ready for me to start working on
Uh,
getting turned on?
I am. Just give me a cue, and we'll go from there. It looks like we have enough for quorum tonight, so we should be good.
Yep. All right. Give me 30 seconds.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, we are live.
Thank you for joining us tonight. It is our study commission on independent police oversight. We are meeting at 6 o'clock, February 8th, 2021. Thank you all for joining us this evening. And can we please go ahead and do roll call, Diane?
Kathy Boyle,
Betty Boyle, present remotely from East Lansing, Michigan, Ingham County.
Heather Colwood,
Megan Callwood, attending virtually from Douglas, Massachusetts, Worcester County.
Hutchison,
Attending virtually from East Lansing, Michigan, Ingham County.
Joel Garcia Jr.,
Jamal Garcia Jr. attending virtually from Ingham County, East Lansing, Michigan.
Chuck Grigsby,
Chuck Grigsby, East Lansing, Michigan, Egan County. Present.
Cedric Carroll,
Senator Correa attending virtually from Mason, Michigan, Ingham County.
Helen Josephson,
Helen Josephson, attending virtually from Graham County, Michigan, East Lansing.
present there from East Lansing, Michigan. Right,
Present, East Lansing, Ingham County, Michigan.
Eric Williams,
Eric Williams, East Lansing, Michigan, Ingham County.
Glenn Bacon,
Present attending virtually East Lansing, Michigan, Clinton County.
and Quentin Taylor was unable to attend, correct?
Thank you, Diane. We have quorum, and we'll go ahead and go to item 1.2. Assuming that there is no amendments or edits, I would like to entertain a motion for approval of the agenda of 2/8/2021.
I move approval of the agenda. This is Chris Root.
So moved by Vice Chair Root. Is there a second? Seconded by Commissioner Callwood. Is there any discussion on the agenda? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. So moved. And just for a friendly reminder, when you do make a motion or vote, just give me a visual and as well as a verbal if you don't mind, so we can make sure we're nice and clean with that. Thank you so much. We'll move to item 1.3, approval of the minutes of 1/25/2021. If there's no amendments or edits to that, I'll look for approval of the minutes of January.
Motion,
Moved by Commissioner Joseph. Is there a second? Seconded by Vice Chair Root. Is there any discussion in regards to the minutes? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. So moved. All right, we'll move to item 1.4, written communication from everywhere and ourselves. So we got quite a list here. And so just for you to know, as you can read there, item 6 through 12 was accidentally added. It's my mistake. I sent the email to everyone. to let you know about the HRC meeting, but all the notes in there are included. So we'll go ahead and bypass a good chunk of that. The first line item is the memo that we had on the contact stats that was in the chat that was made public from our previous meeting. And I think it speaks for itself. Now it's available to the public. Does anyone have any comments or statements in regards to that first line item? Seeing none, we'll move on to the next item there. We have racial disparities and stops submitted by Vice Chair Root. Did you want to speak to that? Or was there any reactions to that information? Anyone want to have any discussion in regards to that written communication? I did talk about this just, in our HRC meeting. It really speaks for itself as far as what the disparity is. And I think really the conversation is like, how do we get here and what are we willing to commit to do in getting that really looked at in a way that we can really have some healing and change with that. And I think I said what I said about that enough, but it's definitely something that concerns me deeply. And Chief Johnson also acknowledged it in our meeting, took responsibility for it. It's something that he's dedicated, he said publicly, in addressing and improving upon when on his watch. So that's all I'll say with that, and I'll go ahead and move on. Thank you. All right, so Chief Johnson, would you like to speak to the presentation that you sent, just real briefly, generally, so we can have it acknowledged, kind of what that was to you and what the information is that you submitted? It's the East Lansing Police revisions presentation. It's the it's the memo that you sent to City Manager Lahanas, and it had that information there. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. No, good evening, committee. I just appreciate your time. We had our numbers we compiled for 2020, and so the numbers from the first quarter of the year was pretty much the same as the second. I should say the last quarter of the year. First quarter was the stops, the contacts with blacks and people of color were like over 20%, and then the last quarter was about the same numbers. In the middle half of the year was COVID and things like that. So with those numbers staying the same, of course, we don't know what those numbers mean, of course. So they stay the same, and so a little concerning to everybody involved, including me, reference what those numbers mean and things like that. I have a chance to do work along those lines. As you know, we had a great dialogue, great discussion with HRC last week. And so the memo I was just addressing to my boss, just dealing with things that caught my attention and some things that we're going to be addressing in 2021, just to look at things, moving our department in a different direction to some extent. We're just going to be doing things that we say we've been doing that we really have not been doing. But we're going to go down a path of a lot more community engagement, and I just laid out in my memo some things that we are planning on doing. It's a lot of stuff's already in place, or not in place, but moving ahead. And we are working really hard with a lot of different things. I'm stressing my staff because trying to get this accreditation off the ground, and it takes a lot of horsepower to get that off the ground. And I'm tasking my to do that. Other responsibilities also. So it's the accreditation is critical for us. There's also some things that we're working on. I'm doing most of the community policing stuff, assigning out alerts to people, and readings and books and things like that on community-based policing and things of that nature. So we're moving ahead, and we're really excited about what 2021 and future years have in store. We got a young department, young bunch of supervisors, so it's great opportunity for us to make some headway and some changes.
Thank you, Chief Johnson. Didn't mean to put you on the spot there, but that was very helpful, I think, for anyone that didn't tune into the HRC meeting and give some context. And then also including there was a presentation given by Deputy Chief Gonzalez about some of those changes and commitments and some of the ways that they're going about that Chief Johnson spoke to. Yes, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchinson.
Chief Johnson for this information. And, you know, it's kind of like in court, right? When something is said, and like, hey, strike that from the record. Like, I can't, like, unsee this, right? But like, for our committee, and for HRC, I read it. And so one of the things that, as I'm going through this process, being part of this committee and this commission, and then even looking at this information that you sent and the information that was reported out to HRC, then I'm reminded of what is really the work of this commission and then the permanent commission, right? What's the end goal, the end game, and how and what the work is that's going to achieve that. And so, meaning like, what's the culture shift? What's the culture change? Because obviously, the numbers aren't unique for Black people in particular, or people of color. This is like, these are numbers that we see across the nation, right? Like over policing and with Blacks, that's typical, and we see those numbers. But what's the root of that? What is the root of the over policing of Blacks? And then it comes down to that culture shift that has to happen with the people. Like, where are the hiring practices? When police officers are brought on and they are identified to have this type of behavior toward a group, you know, what's been done and how quickly those steps. And I understand collective bargaining agreements because I have one at my place of employment, so our employees go through that, so I understand those steps. But I do think that all the time that we're spending doing this work, which is great work and it's needed, necessary, and then even the work that's going to be yet to do from the seated permanent commission, I'm still thinking that, because even like, as you said, you were still kind of caught off guard when you saw the results, expecting that some things would have shifted with some of the things that you put in place since you've been the chief since October, and even hearing you say today that, hey, we're going to really get busy about the work that we said we were doing. And so I'm just really wondering, like, how effective will that work be if there's not a cleansing, if you will, of the culture that might already be so deeply ingrained in the DNA of the police force in East Lansing.
Commissioner, you have a great point. Actually, Mr. Chair Grigsby mentioned actually that last Wednesday also, mentioned the same type of the culture and things of that nature. And actually, it's funny, I teach organizational behaviors to police officers around the country. And this culture, and of course, we have a great culture in the East Lansing Police Department, because I used to work there for 30 years, and we have great people there. But as you mentioned, Commissioner, there are things that we have done that's part of our department, and some of that stuff may need to be looked at a little further deep down and see what's going on. And making those changes, we actually do have to go to what you mentioned. We have to go to the bottom part of our department at ground level and see what we're doing. We already got people working on certain things. We're going to be divvying out work reference, our police academies, our hiring processes. What are we doing? How are we teaching once we hire somebody on board, how are we training them in our field training program? How are we creating this ELPD police officer? So we are doing a huge dive into our organization. Everyone's going to be chipping in to work on gathering information and looking at what our tasks, things of that nature that we're training to, see what the MCOS is teaching the people in recruit schools, and looking at our hiring practices and things of that nature. And you know, it's a huge undertaking in a way, but it's important. I think even from our standpoint, we need to take that look instead of just looking at the surface stuff. And that's like putting paint on a house and things like that. But we do have to get inside the house and see what's going on in other different rooms and things of that nature. And I'm not sure if the department's excited about it, but I teach it around the country, and I know what we need to do. And it's not necessarily it's not difficult stuff, but it's going to take time for us to go into all the different rooms and see what's in there and things like that. And I'm confident that our employees will if they look at it as from a positive standpoint, and try and make our department better and make our community a little more better, and we're servants of the community. You know, I hope this is a positive outcome for everybody involved, and I think hopefully everyone will hop on a bandwagon and take that deeper dive into how we're doing certain things in our place.
Thank you, Commissioner Ellsworth, for that question, and thank you, Chief Johnson, for the answers and the commitment. Yeah, it's important work. And so I'll move on to, looks like we'll cancel out most of this and we'll jump all the way down to the use of force data submitted by Vice Chair Root, which really is another set of information that really confirms a lot of what we've been kind of really talking about so far this evening. And I know Vice Chair Root wanted to speak to this information, so please go ahead.
This is information that came in the memo to our study committee. It was the second batch of answers to the long list of questions that we asked for. And so we received this right after the Human Rights Commission met on Wednesday. So, you know, we did, as Chief Johnson said, 24% of the stops were African American. We learned a month ago or so that 34 to 40% of arrests every year by East Lansing Police Department are African Americans. And then we learned on Friday of last week that in the 4 years from 2017 to 2020, more African Americans had use of force used against them than white people by East Lansing Police Department. And whether this should be surprising is not the issue. Whether it is okay is the issue, and it is not. And we had, you know, as a goal, getting this information about arrests, stops, use of force, and now we have it. There is much, you know, what we have is you know, a base of information. It is not all the information that there is to have or all the explanation. But I think it's something that we need to own as a community, that this is what is happening in our town. And we need to take it seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Is there any other comments or responses to the data? I'll just make, please go ahead, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison.
And I will say, I stand by my comment that I made, because I do feel that, yep, the data is still not a surprise. No, it's not okay, but I still stand by my comment, because unless you get to the root cause, the data will be the same in 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024. So unless there's a cleansing and a real shift in the culture, it's going to be the same conversation years down the road that we've had for all of my lifetime and beyond. So I'm standing by that comment.
Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, Councilmember Bacon, please go ahead.
Just to kind of piggyback on Commissioner Etchinson's comments, I think one part that's kind of missing from what you just said, Kelly, is I think we've had, when we say we had this conversation, I don't think this conversation's been had very long. And I think the comment I mentioned on hearts and minds and that kind of thing, I think this conversation is just beginning. And this data is just telling you that this conversation needs to be had. So a lot of what from their presentation as far as law enforcement on the changes and the structural things, you're dead on, because Stephen and Chief, I think they can do much structurally. They are A1 and they've done so much in a short period of time. It's astronomical, the changes. So we're now down to this conversation and the importance of having and getting community buy-in. There's a much bigger conversation that needs to be had, and that may be something that needs to be considered in the role of Police Oversight Commission, what conversations need to be had out there. Because I have full confidence of Steve and Chief that they're going to get to the bottom of the training and the end goals. And that's an understatement. They're excellent, and they've done so much already. It's just a matter of how do we make this important in the community. You know, make these numbers have meaning. So I think, yes, African Americans have been having these conversations. I think a lot of people have thought these numbers would have been exaggerated, or I think this conversation is just beginning in this community. So, some of our disappointment, we could treat this as a little bit of day one, because I don't think everybody would have believed the numbers. So, without seeing them. So, here we go.
Thank you, Councilman Bacon. Any other responses? Yes, Commissioner Reed Davis, please go ahead.
Yeah, I don't say much in the meetings. I really just observe and listen. But honestly, like, this isn't shocking. Like, I'm only 21, and I've been dealing with this my whole life at this point. And I just wanted to say that I really hope that as a committee, we can change something. And I know that some things have been done, but it's so hard to change people's mindsets and people's beliefs and the way that people were raised. So I really hope that these numbers and the facts that are being stated and the changes that we're trying to make are effective, because at the end of the day, I'm not sure what we can do as a committee to change the police, the heart of the police department. And that is the police that are there every day, risking their lives and risking our lives. So I really just hope that these numbers and these statistics mean something to people, and that all this work actually means something.
Thank you, Commissioner Reed Davis. Commissioner Boyle, please go ahead.
Thank you. I listening to all the comments before and having reviewed the statistical information that Chris put together, to me this underlines the importance of this committee's work to move with appropriate dispatch to come together with a recommendation on an independent commission for council to act on. Because I think this underlines the importance of having an outside body like is proposed here and working on it as quickly as we can to help change come about.
Thank you, Commissioner Boyle. Any other responses? Yes, City Manager Lahanas, please go ahead.
Yeah, so, I think that Chief and I have been looking at the data this past week with Wayne Hardy and senior staff, and we're all concerned. We obviously are a bit disappointed because we hoped that there would be change, that there would be some reduction of positive movement, and it really isn't. So for us, one of the items on the agenda is an RFP to have consulting services, so we can get the benefit of an outside set of eyes, as someone who's an expert in this, to be able to help us look at the data and understand if there are things procedurally or systemically we're doing wrong, to identify those things for us, to give us indications, to try to help us in that respect, and also just to have someone outside look at it. But I think we also have to look at it ourselves sort of more in depth and more broadly. More in depth to see what are the specific situations, are we doing things right, and how we're managing our department, how these occurrences happen. But also more broadly to look at other cities, to look at the Greater Lansing region, to look at Union County to see what the statistics look like. Are we doing something much different than everybody else? And even if the numbers are broadly across the region, and I haven't looked at them yet, we still have to put forward the best effort we can to do a cultural shift internally. And I think that that's something that we've committed to. So we're talking about changing the hearts of our officers and everybody. I think everyone acknowledges we've all sort of come to an aha moment that there's this I don't want to say intrinsic bias, but this sort of unstated bias that everyone can operate under. And then how do we better train ourselves, our employees, to recognize that and then overcome that bias? And I think that really is the work of this cultural realignment that we're doing with Titus. It's a tremendous commitment that most cities, I don't think any cities that I've heard of have done such a huge commitment. We've been slowed on that because of COVID, unfortunately. Council has started that process. But I'm optimistic that over the next year we will train all of our 400 or so employees. And this is not just a half-day training. This is a full day training over many days and over weeks. This is more like a college course type level. And the point is to try to get our employees to that aha moment for themselves, to recognize their unintentional bias that they may operate under, and then try to have those tools to overcome it, right? And to be able to push back against it and to create a more fair and equitable, not just police department, but whole city organization. Because I don't want to always focus on the police, the whole organization. We can improve the overall community. So I think we have a lot of different fronts to work on. Obviously, non-enforcement type activities with our police social workers and all the things we've been doing in that regard. So I think we have to keep moving forward on all fronts, but I see the work of this committee. We're kind of moving on all fronts, and I think that's appropriate. I think it's got to move on all fronts and keep going, learn the process, keep pushing along and make progress on all fronts, and hopefully over time, we're going to be able to understand this better and make positive changes. A long explanation, but an important issue.
Thank you, City Manager Johannes. Yes, Commissioner Harrell, please go ahead.
I think we need to be a little blunt here, to be honest. Right? Across decades of research and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of points of contact, right? We know that there are two things that you can do that are going to result in force being more likely to be used against you. One of those things is to physically resist the police, right? And people will say, okay, that's a legal standard. If you physically resist the police and police use force against you, that's understandable. Unfortunately, the other thing is failing the attitude test. Right? Because, decades of research demonstrates this, right? Right? So now we're talking about, the stereotype of the angry black woman and things like that, right? In terms of how we determine what failure in the attitude test means, right? When somebody is challenging my authority, am I going to view that differentially based on some of their demographic characteristics? In some instances, who do I allow to challenge my authority? Where in other instances, I say, no, that's not acceptable, right? And there may be a number of reasons for that, right? It may be I'm in a situation where I can't allow myself to be challenged because I actually think that makes things more dangerous for me. Again, right there. There are a variety of reasons that those encounters might go that way, but that's not as simple as, providing de-escalation training, right? That's asking people to think differently about how we do policing in this country. And that's not something that's going to take a year, right? And I respect what Deputy Chief Gonzalez and Chief Johnson are doing, but that is not a short-term process by any means. Right? We're bucking up against 80 years of tradition in terms of what policing has looked like in this country.
Thank you, Commissioner Harrell. You definitely saved me from my emotional response and said what some of the things you said very articulately in a way that I think is able to be heard. One of the things that I'll say about the data that was presented through the department was the way that it was presented. And this is just a humble suggestion, because the way that the data is presented in Vice Chair Root's two pieces of information, it clearly has identifiable information in a way where you understand it a lot faster and you're able to speak on it and make a lot of decisions. In the way that the data that was presented through the department, I had to go through extra steps to try to really put things together and understand it. And then Vice Chair Root's information came out, which really saved me because it allowed me to be able to look at it in a way that I could absorb it, talk about it, and really know where I wanted to talk about it in some kind of, structural way, in a way that's a pathway to improving or being helpful to that conversation. So as we go on and as we move on with presenting information to the community, to the department, I would suggest maybe looking at the models that you've seen here by Vice Chair Root and formulating some of that information in a more attainable way. So it looks like it's not something that we have to look at and figure out. And maybe that's just my personal view on kind of how it's presented, but that's just what my experience in doing that. And if we're going to have people from the public and we're going to have transparency and things like that, they're not going to be able to have the opportunity to be able to understand it in some of those formats that I've seen that we've gotten. And don't get me wrong, I appreciate that information. I appreciate the effort. I appreciate the time that it took to put all that together. I'm just giving you a humble suggestion in the way that it's presented. Any other commissioners have anything to say in regards to read communication use of force data? All right, we'll go ahead and move on. Thank you so much, Chief Johnson, Deputy Chief Gonzalez as well. All right, so we'll move to item 1.5. Pursuant to MCL 15263 subsection 1, limiting public comment to 5 minutes per individual. If we want to entertain that tonight, we can. Justin, do we have anyone on the line?
Yes, there are two people in the queue right now.
Okay, so I'll entertain a motion to limiting public comment to 5 minutes. Is there anyone that wants to make a motion towards that? Yes, it looks like it's moved by Vice Chair Root and seconded by Commissioner Boyle. Is there any other discussion in regards to limiting public comment to 5 minutes tonight? All right, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed to the 5 minute limit? All right. All right, we'll move to item point 2, communications from the audience. Please go ahead, Justin.
All right, so I will go through the queue and allow for people to address the committee one at a time, and I will give a 30-second warning before 5 minutes expires.
Thank you.
The first person is joining directly from Zoom with the name Elena. You may unmute and address the committee. Again, that's a person with the name Elena. If you'd like to address the committee, you may unmute and do so. If not, if you could just please say pass.
Pass, thank you.
Thank you. The next person is phone number ending in 552. Again, that's phone number 552. You may unmute to address the committee.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Hi. Kath Edsel, 1026 Daisy Lane, East Lansing. I think most of you know that I'm incredibly passionate about issues of policing, not only in our community, but across our country. Black people in this community have considered East Lansing a sundown town since I arrived here in 1878. For those of you not familiar, sundown town means a place you don't want to be in after the sun sets because you're very likely to get arrested, assaulted, etc. by the police. And that hasn't changed from 1978 until today. I'm not surprised at all by the data that has shown 20 to 26% of the arrestees, people who are stopped, people who are assaulted by police are Black people in particular and people of color. And neither are most of the Black people that I have spoken with having viewed that data. What's frustrating is that we continue to have commentary that we are shocked about this, that we use. It's going to take a lot more than nice words like cultural shift internally, aha moments, unstated bias, cultural realignment, unintentional bias to bring change here in East Lansing. It's going to require an undoing of policing. And this is what we're talking about across this country, is an undoing of policing. The term defunding policing has been used, but however you term it, we cannot continue to police as we have been policing and try to make a little change here and a little change there and get a different outcome. We simply won't. I mentioned at the HRC meeting the other night, it was holding of information, which to me is exactly a huge basis of the problem. And as I mentioned before, East Lansing Info has had the same problem. We filed a police complaint in 2018, and immediately the police department filed an internal investigation. In so doing, they could then deny us FOIA of all materials related to our external complaint. And I suspect this has been used on other external complaints, the immediate filing of an internal complaint to use divers inappropriately to refuse to release any sort of FOIAble data. And I bring this up again because the Police Oversight Committee is going to have to depend upon the police department to supply them with the information they need to make that isn't going to exist as long as we continue to play these games where we make an internal investigation and thus make the information inaccessible to anyone outside of the department itself. So I welcome the changes that we're talking about. I want to see action, as do everybody and anyone out there who has had issues with the East Lansing Police Department in the past and as we move forward. I'm tired of lip service. I want to see change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, caller, for your comments and your participation. Did anyone want to respond to any of what the caller had said in her call? I'll just apologize, but I'll just say that, yeah, it's, the numbers are not surprising to me. They're not surprising to Commissioner Reed Davis, and they're not surprising to the majority of people who are out here who are about these issues or been a victim of these issues. And the community is tired of lip service. The community is tired of the cosmetic changes. And I hope, as Chief Johnson was talking about, how this information and how he's committed and his department's committed with really doing something about that and seeing that what is happening now is not working. Nothing has changed in a way that is meaningful to the people who are dealing with this. And these events, these interactions, they're life-changing, they're game-changing events. We're talking about affecting the quality of life. We're talking about employment. We're talking about being able to put food on the table. These are not light issues. And we're not just talking about data. We're talking about human beings. And I'll just leave it at that. Is there anyone else on the line, Justin?
No.
All right. Thank you for the caller that came in. We'll go ahead and move on to item 3, presentation. We have the public employee relationship, City of East Lansing labor and law attorney, Mrs. Gouri Satashi. Thank you for joining us this evening in our discussion. We welcome you. And I'm not quite sure the format that you were thinking, but we were here to listen to anything that's helpful. I think maybe some commissioners may have a question or two, but we're here to hear what you have to say.
Okay. Thank you all for inviting me. It's nice to see you all. I did have a brief presentation. Hopefully that will help you in the work that your committee is doing, dealing with. But I'm happy to entertain questions during the presentation as well as afterwards. So if there's a question, please, if you want to interrupt or if you want to wait until the end, that's totally up to you. I'm going to have just a little outline up on my screen, so I may not be able to see if people have a question. So if somebody just wants to verbally interrupt me, I have no problem taking questions during the presentation. My thought with this presentation was to give you all a framework to understand the legal principles governing the employment relationship between the city and its police department employees. And I kind of looked at this from the standpoint of what rights do employees have versus the right of the employer to manage its operations and discipline its employees and do the business of the city. And that's essentially how I view, when I consult with the city, a lot of what we do is this balancing act between the employer's rights and the employee rights. And in the public sector, and in particular where employees belong to a union, there are several layers of rights to consider when you make employment decisions. So what I'm hoping to impart to you today is a flavor of what those employee rights are and how they impact decision making when it comes to discipline or termination. And I apologize, hopefully this is not too basic, but like I said, I wanted to give you sort of just some foundational information to help you as you go along with your purpose in your committee. So in Michigan, there are two kinds of employment relationships. There's at-will employment and there's just cause employment. At-will employment, you may have heard these phrases before, but at-will employment is traditionally where the employer has the right to discipline or to terminate the employee for any reason at all. There doesn't have to be a legitimate reason. Obviously, there are some limitations on that, but generally the idea is that the employer can discipline or terminate without notice, without reason, for basically any reason at all. The contrast to that is just cause employment. And in that situation, the employer can only terminate or discipline for a good reason. And that's where the phrase just cause comes from. There has to be just cause to terminate or discipline. The burden is on the employer to prove that it had a good reason to terminate or discipline. And just cause employment is typically established through a contract, so either an individual employment contract or more traditionally through a collectively bargained agreement with the union. Most public employers, and the city is no exception here, have a combination of at-will and just cause employees. Talking specifically about the police department, these employees are unionized. Their employment is governed by a collective bargaining agreement between their union and the city. And that collective bargaining agreement states that they can only be disciplined or terminated for just cause. So I was talking earlier about this layer of rights that exists for employees. And this is one of those rights, and that is the right to only be disciplined or terminated for just cause. But what does that mean? What does just cause mean? Well, so cause can be established in a couple of different, in a few different ways, and I'll give you some examples. Performance problems, for example, if the employee's been offered numerous opportunities to correct performance problems and they're still engaging in performance deficiencies, that could be cause. Off-duty misconduct, so if they do something in their private life and there's a connection that somehow brings it into the workplace, that could be cause. More commonly, what we see is on-duty misconduct. So, a violation of a work rule or a violation of a department directive, or more rarely, we see instances where the employee's behavior rises to the criminal level. So those types of situations, when they exist, could provide cause for discipline or termination. Now, you'll notice I qualified my statement with the word could, and that's because the consideration of whether there is just cause to discipline or to terminate is a little bigger than simply did the employee engage in the inappropriate or the misconduct. We have to look at other factors when we make disciplinary decisions. So one of the things that we look at is, let's say, for example, in the case of a misconduct, an on-duty misconduct, was there a policy that governed this behavior or a directive from the department? Did there actually exist some written rule that prohibited that conduct? If so, was the employee aware of that rule? Had we given notice to the employee that this was something that if they engaged in, they could be subject to discipline? Has the city actually establish that the employee engaged in the conduct in question. In other words, do we have the proof to establish that they did the thing we're accusing them of? And then, if so, does that conduct actually violate the policy or the directive that we're relying on? Another thing we look at is, has the city disciplined other employees for doing the same thing, or are we somehow singling this employee out and treating them differently? We also look at the level of discipline. So let's say we can establish that there's a policy or a directive. We can establish that the employee was aware of that policy or directive. We can establish that the employee actually did the thing that we're accusing him or her of, and we can establish that the behavior violated the policy. Now we have to look at what level of discipline is appropriate. It has to be related to the seriousness of the conduct. So, for example, we're not going to jump to a termination when the employee has maybe been absent without permission for a day or two. But if it's been an ongoing problem and we've approached the employee about it on several occasions, now we may get to the point where termination is appropriate. This is where you might hear the term progressive discipline applied, and that is the idea that we increase discipline as we go along, starting with, say, a verbal counseling, then a written reprimand, then some time off, and if the employee continues to be a behavioral problem, eventually we get to the point of termination. Now you might be asking why the city has to go through this kind of process when it looks at whether there's behavior that's sufficient to discipline or to terminate. And the reason for that is that these collective bargaining agreements and the city's agreements are not unusual. This is pretty standard stuff in the union in a unionized workforce. These collective bargaining agreements allow the union to challenge disciplinary decisions and to have those decisions reviewed by an independent third party through arbitration. And the arbitrator has the authority to consider, and he or she likely will consider, all of those factors I just talked about in determining whether the city had cause to discipline or to terminate. The arbitrator also has the authority to reverse those decisions, and including, in the case of a termination, reinstating the employee with back pay. So the decision to discipline or terminate necessarily requires consideration of whether the city can actually prove that the employee's conduct was significant enough to warrant some action, and then whether the city can prove that the discipline it imposed was the correct level of discipline for that conduct. And one of the reasons why, just from a sort of a logical or practical standpoint, that we go through that exercise when we talk about discipline is we want to reduce as much as possible the ability of the arbitrator to reverse the city's decision. And that's for any number of reasons, starting with, for example, a cost perspective. We don't want to go through arbitration and pay attorney's fees to defend the city in the arbitration just to have the arbitrator reverse that decision and put the employee back to work with back pay. That's one piece of it. But there's another important piece of that, which is we don't want the city to be in a position where it's imposed discipline and then have that discipline reversed. In other words, sending the message to employees that the city made the wrong choice or that it over-disciplined. It undermines the city's credibility in terms of its labor relations with its workforce. So those are kind of the things that we look at in terms of just cause employment. Another kind of right or a layer of right that employees have is from the Constitution. And as employees of a governmental entity, the city's employees retain their constitutional rights, even in the context of their employment relationship with the city. Now, there are several constitutional rights that are typically implicated in the context of public employment. I just want to talk about two kind of briefly because they are directly related to discipline and termination. You may have heard about this, I think, from the prosecutor a little bit who came to speak to you previously. One of those rights is the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, and then the second right is the 14th Amendment right to due process. So just talking very briefly about the Fifth Amendment right, You're probably all familiar with the Fifth Amendment right, which protects a person from making statements that would incriminate themselves. Now, in the context of public employment, the U.S. Supreme Court has extended that right into the context of workplace investigations. And these are known as Garrity rights. And the Garrity right is the right of a public employee to not have statements, compelled statements, used against them in a subsequent criminal proceeding. So the idea here is that if the employer, while doing an investigation into workplace misconduct, orders the employee to answer questions or compels the employee to answer under the threat of discipline or discharge, then what the employee tells the employer in the course of that investigation cannot be used against the employee in a subsequent criminal proceeding. Now, Garrity rights in Michigan have actually been codified by law to some extent. And there's actually a statute in Michigan that protects that same information when made by a law enforcement officer. So we've got sort of this general idea of Garrity rights that applies to all public employees, not just police officers. But then there's also this law in Michigan that targets specifically involuntary statements made by law enforcement officers and says that those kinds of statements cannot be disclosed publicly. So I only bring up Garrity because it creates sort of a parallel path in the context of discipline and termination. And what I mean by that is when the city does an investigation into whether an employee's conduct warrants discipline, that is going to be treated separately from whether the same conduct violates any criminal laws. That's not to say that the two things can't coexist. You can have both, a city investigation on whether the behavior violated internal policies, as well as a criminal investigation as to whether the behavior violated criminal laws. But the city's focus is going to be on the internal process. And that investigation and whatever statements, if they were compelled or, the employee made the statements because they were ordered to make the statements, those statements are going to remain only part of the city's investigation. They will not be able to be used in the criminal prosecution. And that, of course, is to comply with the Garrity rights that we just talked about. The other right, the constitutional right, I just wanted to bring up again, this is more of a procedural right. It does not specifically impact discipline and termination decisions, but it is something that the city needs to be cognizant of while going through the discipline and termination process, and that is the 14th Amendment due process rights. Now, the 14th Amendment provides that the state cannot deprive a person of life, liberty, or process without due process of law. And in the context of employment, in particular public employment, employees who are just cause employees, so again, typically union employees, are considered to have a property interest in their continued employment for purposes of the 14th Amendment. So that means they can't lose their employment without due process. So what does due process mean? And here again, the Supreme Court has told us what it means in the context of discipline and termination. And what it means essentially is notice and an opportunity to be heard. So in other words, the employee has the right to know what it is that they've been accused of. They have the right to an explanation of the evidence that the city has, and they have the right to present their side of the story. Now, this process of notice and an opportunity to be heard, that has to happen before the disciplinary action is taken. So typically that means the city will hold, a pre-discipline or a pre-termination hearing where the employee is provided with the charges and given, an opportunity to respond, to tell their side of the story, and then the discipline decision is made. Now, as I said, due process is a procedural right, and it doesn't necessarily impact the decision to discipline or terminate, but it is a pretty critical step in the process, and the failure to provide due process could result in a reversal, of that disciplinary or termination decision. So those are kind of the big picture items I wanted to put out to you. as a framework for your questions for me, or as you're thinking, I'm happy to entertain any other questions that all of you have.
Thank you, Ms. Sashital, for that. If we can get back to the screen, so is it, because I can't see everyone right now. Okay, that's on me. I apologize. Did any commissioners have any questions or reactions to the presentation? Yes, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchinson.
Sorry about that. It took a minute to get myself unmuted there. I guess mine is probably more of a reaction because it's all right. But the practical application of the law and a little bit I know how Gary writes is that there's like this application that's not universal you apply, that the courts are doing it all over the place. But so it is what it is in Michigan, but it makes me, it reaffirms, during your presentation reaffirms my passion to continue this work and also my fears. In that last meeting that we had the prosecuting attorney on, she talked about there's this investigative process. Sometimes investigations can have up to like 200 pages. And there's this like pause before charges are brought, if they're brought at all against officers. And I made the comment that, I wish that the officers gave Black citizens that same pause before they have an escalated contact with them. And then as I hear this and hearing that, under the 14th Amendment, and they're right, and I might be confusing that a little bit with the Gouri rights, but where they have the right to know what they're being accused of. Whereas Black citizens, oftentimes when they're stopped and even arrested, don't know yet what they're being accused of. And so it's just interesting how the officers have this double standard that is applied where they want this protection for them, but the same protection that we would like for us, which is the same thing, wanting to know what's the due process, where's the fairness, where's the pause before reacting. And so, like I said, some of it, the law is the law as it relates to the 14th Amendment. But it also reaffirms also my fears in how the system obviously works exactly how it's intended. So while we would like to say it's a broken system, we know that the system is working exactly the way it was initially intended. Not necessarily your presentation, but just the criminal justice system, the whole policing and all of that, how it was initially set up in the targeted audience. And so, we're here today, and it's just interesting how laws are shaped that protects them. And those exact same rights that they want, they don't apply them to Black and brown citizens when they have contact with them.
Thank you,
So that's
Commissioner.
my reaction. Not necessarily anything you need to respond to, or because it's not really a question, it's just more of a reaction.
Thank you, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchinson. Commissioner Boyle, please go ahead.
Right. Just something about Gouri. Remember that the Gouri case actually imposes the duty on police officers. The case came up because a police officer was going to be fired for not answering questions related to his duty, and he had invoked the Fifth Amendment, which we can all do when we're questioned by the police agency. But the court ruled that if the police officer invoked the Fifth Amendment, then his police agency could fire him merely for doing that. So actually, Gouri compels statements by police officers. All it does is the decision protected the officer from having that compelled statement used against him in a criminal proceeding. But it really doesn't interfere with our ability to discipline police officers. because we can compel them to answer our questions. And if they don't answer the questions, we can discipline them for solely that reason, that they refuse to answer the questions. So Garrett isn't really this big blanket employment protection for police officers. It's something we all need to understand, but it doesn't really interfere with the discipline of police officers, nor with the work of our proposed commission in police oversight.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, is that Garrity, and I don't know if I was clear enough, Garrity doesn't really impact the discipline and termination decision. It just sort of creates these two parallel paths where the employer is proceeding on, the impact in terms of the employment path, and then there may be a separate path where there's criminal, charges being considered. And it's more like the two paths can't necessarily overlap because of Garrity. Garrity itself is not a bar to discipline or termination. Garrity is a suppression tool for the employee if they're charged criminally. In other words, it's an argument that they can make in their criminal proceeding to suppress evidence related to statements that they made in the employment context. So it's not a basis to protect the employee from discipline or termination. And you're right that if we order the employee to answer the question, advise them that they've got Garrity. I mean, we don't even have to advise them because Garrity attaches as soon as they're ordered to answer. But if you tell them that they've got Garrity and you order them to answer and they still refuse to answer, that refusal is insubordination, and the insubordination itself is grounds for discipline.
Thank you. Commissioner Williams, please go ahead.
I have a question about the performance evaluations, the performance problems that you mentioned. One form of discipline. You said, if I recall correctly, that if somebody has a history of not correcting their poor performance in the past, they can be disciplined. How long into the past do we look when we're looking at the history of poor performance? Is that a fixed amount of time? Is it negotiated?
Sometimes it's negotiated. I don't know if this particular contract has a period of time that performance evaluations are active. A lot of contracts in this contract may have a period of time that disciplines are active. So after a period of time, the discipline can no longer be considered if it's been more than a couple years, for example. But performance issues are, there's no bright line rule that says 6 months or 1 year or 5 years. It's sort of what is reasonable. I would say if there's performance issues going back a year or 2 years that are documented, where the employee's been advised that this is a performance issue, they've been counseled, they've been given, tools to correct the performance problems, and you're still seeing a performance problem, then you've probably got grounds for some sort of disciplinary action. Performance problems, though, I will say that's fairly rare to see termination over, unless they're really, we're really talking about something that's been going on and there's been a lot of documentation to help the employee. Typically what you're going to see is the on-duty misconduct. And a lot of times there's some overlap, performance problems can overlap, particularly in the police department, I think, with departmental rules and regulations. So, neglect of duty, for example, or excessive force, for example, or things like that. They're both performance issues as well as policy violations. I wouldn't necessarily hang my hat on a termination that's based on performance problems, unless the performance problems, like I said, are ongoing, well documented, and there's been numerous opportunities to correct. I'd rather be looking at as the labor attorney that's going to be defending the city in arbitration, I'd rather be looking at a misconduct violation where we've got the evidence to show that there was the policy violation. They were notified of the policy, and the conduct violated the policy.
Are you familiar with management systems in the police world that are known as early intervention systems or early warning systems?
Are you talking about with regard to employee performance?
Yeah.
Not specifically. I mean, we from a perspective, we often talk about the concept of intervention by way of like a performance improvement plan, or you've got a probationary period. Those are usually built into police contracts where employees are for a period of time upon first hire, subject to at-will employment. They're not just cause employees, and you can if they're not fitting in or they're not their performance isn't up to par, you can remove them. But in terms of some sort of formalized intervention system, no, I'm not familiar with that.
One thing that we've been talking about is an off-the-shelf early warning system or early intervention system. The Michigan State Police evidently have one. Mm-hmm. You can buy these. They correlate various triggers and information about a police officer performance over time, and they have algorithms that the supervisors use to correct the performance of police officers. And these are things that you can buy them. They're like statistical packages.
And what kind of metrics do they use?
I have no idea.
Oh, that's very interesting. We represent a lot of police departments, and I have not heard of that being used, such a formal process. But I think that's really interesting, and I would be open to hearing more about it. It's something we'd have to look at to see how it implicates the collective bargaining agreement. But that is something that may assist, outside of, for example, just a performance improvement plan, which is a little bit less objective. This sounds more objective if you're putting in metrics to trigger sort of an intervention, than just the supervisor reviewing and, putting together a performance improvement plan.
Are you familiar with some of the consent decrees that the federal government has imposed on some police departments over there?
Yeah, like the Detroit Police Department, I'm familiar with that one, yeah.
And frequently a section of those consent decrees will require the police department to adopt an early intervention system or an early warning system. And they kind of spell out the parameters of it in there. The reason I asked about the look back period was that when I saw the contract with the police department, there's that, I think it's 1 year or 2 years, or there's something after 1 or 2 years, your discipline kind of falls off the radar and we can't use it. I don't remember whether it's
24 months.
40?
24.
So, but 24 months, 2 years. So the question was that I had, would a provision like that in a collective bargaining agreement interfere with the operation of a early intervention system?
Well, I'm going to guess that the utilization of such a system may be something that we'd have to bargain with the union. Basically, what the state law is that governs public employment is anything that impacts working conditions is something that is required to be bargained. So, something like an early intervention system that will have an impact on, say, performance evaluations or continued employment. If you have too many, early interventions, that's something that's likely going to have to be bargained. So this idea of, the discipline falling off and potentially impacting the intervention system yeah, it could. And I'm going to guess that if there is such an impact, say, for example, we want to lengthen that period of time because we want our intervention system to work, just throwing that out as an example, that would be something we definitely have to bargain because we've already bargained the 24 months. I'm suspecting that even the use of such an intervention system may have to be something that we bargain. I'd be curious to see what MSP, what their contract says about it. The consent decrees, that's the federal government coming in and forcing that on everybody. But here we don't have that. So we'd have to get the union's buy-in to use that.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams, for those questions. And some of this is a little bit above my pay grade, but my question. Okay, so the 24-month time period is a procedural thing that people can do as an employee based off the union contract or labor contracts. So
the union contract and the labor contract are kind of the same thing. So each union, the city has multiple unions. Talking specifically about the police department, there are 2 unions. Road patrol, the POAF, and then there's the command union. Both of those, I'm suspecting, have provisions in their collective bargaining agreements, their labor agreements, that dictate how long discipline can remain active in the employee's file. So after a period of time, that discipline can no longer be considered by the employer when they make subsequent disciplinary decisions. So when I spoke earlier about progressive discipline, if there's a written reprimand in the employee's file and that falls off after 24 months, and then in month 25, they engage in some behavior, you can't then go to the next step of progressive discipline. You have to start back over at the beginning.
Thank you. Yeah. So, and I'm just asking because I don't know. So that time frame, is that a negotiable thing that you can go into the agreement? Because we have ours coming up, or it's about to, and I was talking to a council member on the phone yesterday, specifically about this time period, about what your involvement is, about what the council's involvement is, and how much are we able to really weigh in on some of these institutional problems with people who have multiple complaints and things like that, and so much time goes by, and then just kind of falls off, and that person, in some ways doesn't have a mechanism for change behavior, just because they got to wait it out. So that's very interesting. That do a lot of contracts have a disciplinary issue that just kind of falls off, or is that just kind of how the police have gotten to a point of it?
Very common in unionized workforce. It's not limited to police departments.
Thank you.
And I just want to, something you said triggered something. I'm talking, this 24-month period release is discipline issued by the city, not necessarily. I don't know if you were talking about the city, not necessarily complaints. So, if there's a complaint from a citizen that results in discipline, then this 24-month period will apply. I'm not aware of anything in the contract that talks about a time period for citizen complaints to drop off. But if the citizen complaint is not substantiated, it's not going to result in discipline. So it sort of becomes irrelevant in the context of discipline and termination decisions.
That's helpful. Thank you. Any other commissioners have any more questions for Mrs. Sashital? Yes, let's see, Manager Lahanas, please go ahead.
All right, so if we had a situation where you didn't have any powers, arbitrators generally sort of infer their own rules by arbitration. Like they would say, if it's more than 2 or 3 years old, they're going to say it's stale anyway. It's not going to consider it. So it's not always so important that we have it because the arbitrator would find the rule anyway. Is that not the case?
That is true. Something I learned from when I became an attorney and I started practicing in this area is it really doesn't matter what you or George or Shelley or I think is just cause. Really what matters is what the arbitrator thinks, because the process gives so much authority to the arbitrator And again, that is not unique to police departments. That is how the union process works. That is how, you know, the DPW contract is written, how the fire department contract is written. That's how they're all written. And so, you know, you're correct that in the event that the contract is silent on something, the arbitrator will impute some reasonable standard by which to judge things. So if we, for some reason, did not have a provision in the contract that said it would fall off after 24 months, the arbitrator would impute some period of time in the absence of something in the contract. And that's just based on, you know, 50 years of labor employment decisions. There's just a whole body of case law that the arbitrator can look at to sort of come up with what is reasonable in the absence of a negotiated provision. But those provisions are, like I said, they're pretty standard. You're not going to find a contract that does not have something like that in it.
Thank you. Yes, Commissioner Williams.
In your experience, do you find it harder to impose discipline against police officers than against other kinds of employees?
It's a really good question. I would say not. It's not that it's harder. It's different because the types of discipline or the type of misconduct that you see with police officers tends to be a little different than the type of misconduct that you see in other departments. And I haven't really encountered a real big difference. In fact, I would say that there's a body of arbitral authority that says that police officers are actually held to a higher standard than other employees of the municipality. Now,
are they really?
Well, I was just going to say whether that's actually true or not. I think, you know, it's sort of a mixed bag. And the cynic in me will say that, you know, arbitrators are chosen by both the labor union as well as the employer. They're not selected by some third party. So arbitrators are only human. You know, they make their bread and butter by pleasing both sides. So it's hard to find an arbitrator who is, you know, very pro-employer, very anti-employee, just like it's hard to find an arbitrator that's very pro-union, very anti-employer. I, you know, have gone to the same arbitrator on similar facts and just gotten different decisions. That's just the way things work because he wants to keep his business from the union. He wants to keep me happy too. Again, that's my cynical side saying that. Like I said, I've had that language used in decisions and decisions upheld where the employer has disciplined law enforcement officers. I've also had situations where I thought, you know, we had a really good case and the arbitrator reversed and reinstated. So there's no, like, I can't look at, you know, the same set of facts and say, we're going to get this decision for sure. And, you know, this set of facts, we're going to get a different decision. It really is sort of up to your arbitrator.
Can I ask one more question?
Please, we'll wrap it up.
There's an old phrase that when the elephants fight, the grass is trampled. So I take it in an arbitration, the arbitrator is trying to balance the rights of the employer with the rights of the employee.
To some extent, really what the arbitrator is looking at is the contract, number one. Number two, they're looking at whether, if you're talking about like a misconduct discipline or misconduct termination, they're looking at what evidence does the employer have that the employee actually did the thing that they're accused of. And then they're going to look at the level of discipline that was imposed. Did we discipline too harshly? So, you know, they can go ahead.
Does the arbitrator look at the rights of the person who complained or the safety of the public?
maybe in sort of the broader context of why we issued the discipline we issued, but it's not necessarily a factor in whether there's cause to discipline. So let's say in the case of an excessive force complaint, the arbitrator is going to be very interested in whether or not excessive force was actually used. That's going to be the first analysis. And let's say that's substantiated. The second thing they're going to look at is the discipline imposed proportionate to what the officer did. And in that second consideration, the arbitrator may consider things like, what is the impact community-wide? Why is the employer wanting to take the decision it did? Is it because there's, a history in the community of excessive force usage by police? But to say that that's like the main consideration, I would say no. That may be an argument we make. The main consideration is really very focused on that particular employee, his history, again, our policies, our contract. It doesn't really look too much beyond sort of that narrow scope.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for the questions, and thank you for the presentation, Ms. Sashital. It was really helpful, and on behalf of the committee here, we really appreciate your time and really just breaking it down for us and helping us work through this. It's very valuable. We'll go ahead and let you go unless someone has something they didn't get a chance to speak if they haven't spoken all before. But we will get you out of here. You're more than welcome to stay if you like, if you find this stuff interesting. But thank you for your time and thank you for your expertise. There may be a commissioner or two that may have a follow-up question for you. Is it okay that they contact you through via Diane email and just kind of have some follow-ups?
Yeah, that's fine. I have no problem, and I'm happy to help you guys.
Thank you so much, and you have a good evening.
You too. Take care.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for initiating that discussion. We are at new business item 4.1. We have this RFP listed and proposed here. Thanks for sharing that, staff. I know it was something you didn't have first on here, but thank you for providing this for us. Did any commissioners have any response or questions in regards to the RFP? Yes, Vice Chair Root.
Does anybody else want to speak to this, do you think? Well, I want to speak to it a little bit. I know we're trying to get to our main topic tonight without continuing to work on the recommendations. I'm one of the people who asked that this be on our agenda, even though, we aren't prepared to have this particular RFP on our agenda. But it came up at the HRC meeting that this RFP was ready to go. And it just seemed to me that having it on the agenda of some public meeting was worthwhile, so people would have a chance to look at it. I spent most of the afternoon writing 1,000 words about this, which I'm not going to say. But I have three basic thoughts. One is, we are doing a lot. I'm using the we, not just about the study committee, not primarily about the study committee. I'm really using it about the ELPD. ELPD is going through a tremendous amount of things right now that involve data. I will start with the best, in my view, 3 policy changes. The restricting license plate review to articulable reasons, the disorderly conduct code changes by the city council, the addition of social workers to the staff, and all of those. I think, when we talk about how are we going to make change in our community, well, changing policies is a mighty good way to try. And these are 3 recently changed policies. And when we change policies, we need to have the opportunity to figure out if they're making a difference. And so I think that is one of the things that's going on that requires requires research, use of data, metrics, looking, at evaluation into the future. ELPD is also working hard on getting accredited. There are 108 criteria for accreditation, sorry, not criteria, standards. Some of those have to do with what kind of data you collect, how you use your data, how you report your data. I think somebody, Steve, you've said something like 7 people are working on this in the department. I imagine one thing you're doing is saying, here are all the standards, here are where we are, here are the things where we need to make changes or additions. And some of those have to do with data and information analysis. All of them are a lot to work on, but some of them do. There's the early warning system that you both have talked about wanting to implement. That also has to do with your records management system, your data, how you use data, how supervisors use it, how you make sure that the data is entered in a way you can use it. We've already talked tonight about a lot of information that's being made public for the first time. And that I think there's a hunger for that. And I think there's also, last week, the study committee, 2 weeks ago, our last meeting, the study committee talked about it's important for the Oversight Commission to have a role in trying to help make data more available to the public in ways that are meaningful and useful. So, some steps have been taken, some progress is being made. I think there's a lot, there are information like about use of force. We discovered that the information that we have had for years is wrong, that the public could see, was considerably wrong. Others, we just have had a complete absence, of information. And I recall well, your very first presentation back in October was about arrests. And several of us said, oh my goodness, there's so much more we'd like to know about who you are arresting. Because those are folks we need to be concerned about in planning for the Oversight Commission. And I remember, I think it was Chief Johnson saying, well, I would like to know more about who these people are too. And I understand that you're, I think, working on an RFP that's separate about that, learning more about who's being arrested. So there is a lot going on about data, collecting it, how to use it. I watched this weekend a webinar on data in policing, organized by My Brother's Keeper, which is the organization that put together the Mayor's Pledge that turned into the June 9th resolution that our City Council passed about we will review our use of force and we will recommend changes to the use of force policy. It was an excellent webinar, and there were people on it from the open, I'm not going to get all of this right, the Center for Policing Equity and the Stanford Open, I'm not going to get it all right, but the Stanford one is entirely about traffic stops or police initiated stops. And couple of the points they were making was, for using data, it is important to have some collaboration between the department and the public about what needs to be done with improving data, and also to make sure that when the data is, when the work is done with the data, that the reports can be understood by all the stakeholders. Reports that can only be understood by, somebody with a statistical degree, and maybe with luck, the police chief, most of whom don't have statistical degrees. But, is it going to be understood by officers? Is it going to be understood by the city council? Is it going to be understood by anybody in the public? Well, in our university town, it'll be understood by some people, but not everybody. That we need to be thinking in terms of everybody's interests when we work with data and think about, where we're going to get from here to there with learning new data. And I bring that kind of orientation to look at the RFP for the looking at traffic stops. And I just don't think it meets the test. I don't think it meets there are a couple of tests I don't think it meets. I don't think we've done, and I don't know how y'all came to this, so I don't pretend that I do. But I think when we spend money, it needs to be based on some kind of a sense that this is a priority. That among all the ways we could spend money, in this case, how we could spend money to improve policing and get more information about policing. Is this a priority? Is it going to help us solve a problem? And are we confident that getting more data will help us solve the problem? And are we confident that we'll get data that we can actually use, that people will understand, that will help us see if we have improved performance or solved a problem or made progress in some way? I read the 3 studies that are referenced in the RFP, the Lansing one, Ann Arbor, and Portland. I've read the Lansing one a couple of times. I'm not convinced that the Lansing study helps change practices about stops over time. I'm also not at all convinced that it's intelligible to people. I'm going to read a couple sentences from the abstract, and I'm going to read it from the abstract because it was the same abstract the year before. There will always be some variation between each maps analysis. However, none of these variations have shown anomalous patterns. Consistent with the research findings, it is improbable that driver demographics will be the same as community demographics in any community because of factors identified by the National Institute of Justice. Thus, there is some demographic variance in traffic stops compared to the 2010 census characteristics in Lansing. The differences do not appear significant and are consistent over the 19 years of the MAPS program. And that's what they said the year before. So the year before it was 18 years. It's number crunching. It's number crunching to see, how much can people say we're racist? And can people say we're less racist than we were before? And obviously I'm using my own language here. The question of, does it defend us from claims that we're racist, is not a good goal to have. And, I'm reading between the lines, but I don't think this study is about helping to reduce racial disparities. I don't think that's really its fundamental purpose. The Portland study is like a great literature review. It says the way you reduce racial disparities is you do a lot of benchmarking. None of the benchmarking is perfect, so you do more than one set of benchmarking. And here are 9 types of benchmarking you can do. And the Stanford organization that I mentioned has lots of studies. The Center for Police Equity, I read yesterday, they've done a guidebook that they published in 2020 with the New York University Policing Research Unit. A guidebook on how to do research on police stops. It's an excellent guidebook. That work has been done. The issue of how can this be done has been out there for a long time. We do not need to spend money to hire somebody to review the literature on how to do this. And in a number of cases, the problem is that you don't have the data that could be used for some of the benchmarking. Well, if we look at some of the literature that's out there, we can look at our data and say, what data do we have? It's work that you're going to end up having to do if you hire a consultant anyway. But if you do it before you hire a consultant, you can make a smarter RFP. And also, we know that we have disparities in stops, in arrests, in use of force. Is there a well thought out reason why we're only looking at stops? There might be a well thought out reason, but it may also be good to include Well, it isn't just us where this is a problem. If you want to get answers you can use about how to make improvements. So I would really suggest that, you know, if we had the Oversight Commission, I'd say let's get a subcommittee of the Oversight Commission to work with a couple people at the police department. Take into account all these processes you've got underway. See how we can, you know, get on the same wavelengths so that this isn't another task, but rather some tasks you're already doing, to see how we can figure out how to use data to solve our problems, and to make sure we've got our handle on the data, that we know what data we've got, we know how we're, you know, that it's being reported well, we can really use it to think about what to do next. It seems to me that would be that's more the moment we're at, rather than let's put money into a RFP where I'm not clear that it's really going to help solve a problem. I'm somewhat more open to being convinced that an RFP to help us learn more about who's being arrested could be helpful if there really is data we can't get ourselves. But even there, I'd say, let's, you know, you've got this start at sharing a lot more information. Let's see what that's added up to. Let's see how much it can be improved. Then you can see, okay, what money can we spend on some outside analysis that will really move us forward. I'm just not convinced that we're there. I don't want to, you know, I think data is helpful. That's very clear to anybody who's been sitting with me at these meetings. So I am not giving a message that I want to discourage the police department from digging into data and analyzing it better. I believe that's useful, but I also think it needs to be done strategically, and it needs to be done in a way that is collaborative and in a way that will have results that are designed to be really useful for what you're trying to do and that people will be able to understand. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Vice Chair Rue. I just really appreciate your comments. Appreciate that, you know, I think, you know, being able to have someone look at that and talk about what they think is better is important. And I hope it's something that's taken seriously and really thought about as far as kind of really what your goal is and what you want to get out of this information, and really looking at what you want to improve upon. City Manager Lahanas, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I do. You know, it's actually Chris that suggested which I thought was a good idea, because, you know, obviously this committee is something of a public committee. This is the closest thing you have to a police perspectives, and input is very helpful to us. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate Chris taking it very seriously, looking at it. He raises some good points, and I do agree that one of the things we have to do that's very important is just measuring something. I think in and of itself has a learning curve. So the fact that we're measuring this data and we're holding ourselves committed to that, we're going to look at it ourselves, the community's going to see it, we're going to see it over time, is one way we can try to improve. But I do think it's important to have some sort of an objective look from someone outside the community, outside the organization, to say, yes, you are over-policing. Let me tell you why. Let me show you the number where it should be. Let me explain to you where you're hitting these hit points of what you're doing wrong, or maybe some things we're doing right. And someone outside can give us that advice. Because right now, we're staring at lots of different numbers. We're staring at a population of the community by census that's 8% African American. And I know the studies say the city isn't in a bubble. You can't use that as a firm number. But when we see 22% or 25%, it rightfully for all of us causes some concern. That's why we're talking about this, right? So how do we put this in context? How do we, as the people running the department, have a context to say, how far off are we? Where should this be? What should we be doing? What are the strategies that other departments have implemented to reduce this? So I think that having more eyes and more assistance, I don't think is unhelpful. Maybe you could argue waiting a little bit to see if there's some change in it, because we're an unusual period, we made lots of changes, is reasonable. But I hear from other people, we've got to keep moving. And from all of us, we want to keep moving. We want to make progress. So it is tough to say, let's wait on this important look till we have more information. But from other quarters, we hear we're not moving fast enough. And I'm interested to hear what more people think about it, because we're ready to move on this, and that's why we're here.
Thank you, City Manager Johannes. We got a couple people that want to weigh in. I believe it's Commissioner Boyle, Councilmember Bacon, and then Commissioner Harrell. All are in line.
Thank you. I support Commissioner Wood's comments regarding this. I noticed that the purpose of the project is stated in the RFP. The purpose of the research is to determine the extent of racial disparities and offer officer-initiated contacts at the East Lansing Police Department. And actually, that extent has been already demonstrated to a great extent by the work already done by the department and Commissioner's Ruth's punching of the details. So perhaps working on some of the other issues right now before we put together an RFP that will be truly useful in addressing the disparities, because I think we know the extent of them, or at least we're beginning to know the extent of them in black and white numbers. I think we already have that determined, and maybe we need to move forward on some of the other things before we expend money on an RFP that is likely to produce the same information that we've already gathered and that we can continue to gather as we move forward with the rest of the work in the city to address these concerns.
Thank you, Commissioner Boyle. Councilmember Bacon, please go ahead.
Yeah, I consider, from my world, I consider data issues to baseline. 2020 is a really difficult year to use as a baseline in the first place. And what are you even doing with that data? It's people movement is down, everything's down, encounters are down, everything's down. No, it's snail's pace. How valuable is 2020's data anyway? I think maybe we do need to look a little further back and then say, what's the impact of the new tactics and strategies long term? I think that's going to be the big question. Like, what, as you implement new tactics and new strategies, what does that mean? Like, the numbers are what they are from that perspective. And then for the seated board, I brought this up in HRC. We got to ask what the community standard is. There's going to be labor standards. There's going to be other standards. What's the community standard for policing? What is the Police Oversight Commission in disagreement in how something's being done per what we assign as a community standard, regardless of what Chief says the standard, MCOL says the standard is? Does this match up to who we say we are and that type of thing? So there's hearts and minds element in there, and that's maybe the things around the DE&I training and total things like that. There's got to be an agreement on how we want to be policed as a community, because there's a collective out there that clearly would think we're being policed just fine. So even surveying, all these things, we got to decide on what's the standard and what's the baseline, and then what are we working from? What are we trying to bring the standard to? I think those are determinations, and that's something. And then the culture, what's the norms and standards beyond the data? I think that you can have all the data. I think the data is clear. I don't know how many more ways you can slice it. This is how my brain works for my profession. I'm in sales, and you're up or you're down. I don't know if we're up or down yet. I don't know what 19 looked like, 18, anything like that. So this is a weird conversation for me, but I'd be curious to know which direction that we're going, and then we determine the why along the way, and then what does the community want out of policing? There's a set of people out there that think we're being policed just fine, regardless of what those numbers say or what the stats say. So there's some work to be done in that area, and that's obviously not going to be acceptable based on our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and changing hearts and minds with them. But that's this is community-wide efforts. There's going to have to be some element of that for the Police Oversight Commission to convince this is how we want our police force to look. This is how we want to be policed.
Thank you, Councilmember. Please go ahead, Commissioner Harrell.
So I'll just say this to Vice Chair Root's point. I am a statistician. I teach graduate level statistics courses. And if at the end of this project, somebody comes to you and says, this is where the number should be, then you've been conned. You've wasted your money. Because it's not possible to make that kind of assertion. Right? We can have that conversation about all of these different benchmarks and where we want to be, but there's no, this is where we should be, right? There's a disparity there. We all know there's a disparity there. We can play with the benchmarks and say, well, the disparity is worse if you compare it to this denominator versus this denominator. But ultimately, that doesn't matter, right? Ultimately, all that matters is reducing that number, right? That conversation needs to be about what can we do to get that number lower. And I don't think that having an RFP that says this is what the numbers look like necessarily lends itself to the conversation of this is how we reduce that number. It's possible that we can do that. That's more a conversation about we know what the number is already. Let's talk about why it's that way and therefore how we can change things to lower that.
Thank you, Commissioner Harrell. Does anyone else have? Yes, City Manager Hans, please go ahead.
Well, I'm happy going back with this feedback and reconsidering this. We want information that's useful. We want to spend our resources the right way. So let's take a little bit of a pause and think about it with more than ourselves and see if we can come up with something. Let's take a pause. How about that? And then we'll see if there's something more that we want to spend the money on later. After we have more information perhaps. I think that'll be with the subsequent commission. The actual permanent commission asks for something, and then we can be more tailored to what we want to find out, as opposed to doing that at this point. So if that's what I've heard from the feedback, and it sounds like reasonable feedback, let's put this on hold for. And we can talk to our council as well. If our council has a different view, then obviously we work for council inevitably. But we can say that this committee has spoken and thought that perhaps waiting to get more internal look at our data, more information before jumping into another study would be useful.
Thank you, City Manager Hannes. I just think that's incredible. Your response to something that you guys were doing, and you allowed us to be able to speak on it tonight and really heavily consider it. So I really have a lot of respect for that. So thank you for that. Is there anything else from anyone in regards to this item that we're on right now, the RFP? Any more comments? Okay, we'll go ahead and move on from item 4.1, old business. So we're going to go to old business 5.1 on discussion, recommendation of models and composition. So we're following up on our conversation from what we had last couple of weeks here, and we were really getting to the models. And correct me if I'm wrong, Vice Chair Root, but we just kind of really want to get your weigh in on kind of how you're thinking about that, so we can kind of come to a general consensus about what we're thinking this actual oversight is going to be kind of really looking at and how they go about their business, if that's fair to say. So I'll open it up for discussion if anyone wants to chime in on item 5.1. And we're talking about section 3 if people are a little bit lost. And this was done by Commissioner Harrell in his work. We were talking about functions. Now we're moving into the model side of it all. And it really will weigh us in and let us go into then the discussion about police complaints and things like that for what we have going on. So does anyone have any comments or reactions or opinions about what they're reading there in section 3? Yes, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchinson.
I know that I have a question to ask, but I think I might wait and see what the comments are on the models. But I did reach out about being on the agenda to talk about the composition. So we're looking at the models right now, but at some point I want to talk about what the composition might look like for that
permanent oversight commission. So this might not be that right place, that sweet spot. I just wanted to, I know you told me, you're like, hey, do you want to wait and bring it up in this area? So you just, I'll wait here. Maybe say, yep, let's talk about that.
Yes, Commissioner Ellsworth, I got your back. I asked Diane politely to kind of put that in there to make sure we had your back on that. So yes, we definitely will be having that. In regards to the models, and kind of really your idea about kind of really, specific to our needs here in our community, what are you thinking? What are you hoping for? What do you expect? Yes, Vice Chair Root.
I think part of this, we don't have to have big surprises here about what people are thinking about. We just need to kind of get through this piece of intellectual work about which of the models is more appropriate to East Lansing and that we think will be most effective. And we've kind of alluded to it in some previous discussions, but we haven't really hit on it. So I would just say that the investigatory system that Cedric, outlined is really more for a larger city with a much larger police department, larger number of complaints. That's not a match for us. A review system is probably much more a match for a city of our size. And also that the hybrid system number 5 is a combination of things. And we've talked at our last meeting about thinking that it's important not only to be about reviewing individual complaints, that we think it's very important to be able to make policy recommendations, to look at information, and how we use data. So I think the direction our conversation has been going in is a hybrid model with a review component of complaints.
I would agree with that. That's how I kind of saw it, and saw how realistic that model, the hybrid model, with a little splash of maybe a little monitoring in there. But I'm with you on that. Did anyone else have a comment in regards to their opinion? Yes, Commissioner Boyle.
Yes, I would agree that the hybrid system is best going to fit our needs, because I think we definitely want to do review. But if we're going to really impact change, the way to do that is through revising the policy and process. And a hybrid system would create a commission that was tasked with doing both of those functions. So I really think that's what we need.
Yes, Councilman Bacon.
I think, not to take it out of your hands, I think the review process was kind of out of you guys' hands. That's coming your way anyway, because that's coming out of the preview of the Human Rights Commission, so that was mandatory. So whatever extra hybrid elements or powers you want to assign to the commission, that's just fine. But review is almost automatic. That was coming your way. So
thank you. I couldn't agree with you more on that. Anyone else? I think we kind of have an idea, unless someone has something, if there's something different than you have, and I would love to hear your opinion on that and your why, so we can definitely consider it, and understand that, and maybe get a different take. Does anyone have anything different from the hybrid model with what we've discussed so far this evening? Okay. All right, so we got a general consensus, Vice Chair, kind of really what we've been talking about and what direction we're going to and what fits best for our community. Commissioner Ellsworth Edgerton, did you want to go ahead and weigh in now?
Sure. So when I look back on the composition and what City Council was looking for when making up this body, two members from the student body, 4 residents of East Lansing or individuals with pertinent experience. And I'm thinking that meant experience with maybe contact with police or I don't recall what that was, experience with what. One member affiliated with the American Civil Liberties Union, one member affiliated with the civil rights oriented organizations such as Black Lives Matter and NAACP, one member with expertise in law enforcement who's not an active duty police officer, and one East Lansing City Council liaison. So when I look at that, and it may be a stretch that City Council will be looking for some similar makeup for the permanent body, and I guess I should just stop and ask the question before I make an observation of something that I feel is missing.
Did you want to respond to that, Councilmember Bacon?
Yeah, that's in your purview as well. You guys see a different head count, demographics. If there's other determinations, you just make that recommendation. You can go from there. I think that's not a problem.
Okay, so this recommendation that I'm gonna put out there, it's not for anything that we need to decide on tonight, because it's probably gonna make everybody a little uncomfy and squirmy a little bit, and you're gonna have to like sit and process it. But one of the things I feel is missing, unless that one thing that talked about 4 residents of East Lansing with some kind of, or individuals with experience, pertinent experience, took care of that. But I recall like having to submit a resume, going online, applying, blah, blah, blah. But one of the things I think of when I think of the community, what makes up the community outside of business and residents and people involved in community organizations and all of that, is I think of people that are also reformed, like reformed felons, that also make up this community, that have impact or contact with police, or have had. And so whether they turn their lives around based on things that they actually did do and they served their time and they have a vital voice because they also are in this community, or they were falsely accused of something but they still ended up with a felony on their record and all of that. And so that's something I feel that a lot of, not just this organization, this body, but a lot of community bodies, and I'm involved in a lot of community organizations, I feel missed that mark. And I don't know if they're afraid to step out and involve people that have had some kind of past, but want to be involved and have a voice. But I do feel, like I said, that's not something that we got to be like, yep. Because I know people might be a little uncomfortable with that because now we're talking about involving someone in part of a police thing. But I feel like if we are okay, and I know we're not, because that's why this body is here, but we know that we have police officers serving as active officers that have some misconduct or have had some misconduct, but they still are allowed a second chance. They're still allowed to continue on. They're still allowed, but yet our citizens somehow get that opportunity. So that is a piece that I feel missing when you look at community in the composition of voice that should be part of this body.
Thank you, Commissioner. No, thank you. No, I didn't, I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't even think about that element, and how valuable that can be to that commission, and just having that representation there. Yes, Councilmember Bacon, please go ahead.
I think more intentional on that type of thing around that. It's clearly not disqualified. Even in the language of what you write up, it's not necessarily a spot or whatever it has to be. You don't have to have there's specific slots prescribed for each individual demographic, but we should be clear that I might assume I'm not qualified. And clear in the language that in this, even if you've had prior contact with law enforcement or been incarcerated or been all that, just some kind of clear language that you're welcome to. I think that you just struck on a broader question. I don't feel like wrestling with it right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments in regards to Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison's composition input? Doesn't look like anyone wants to challenge you tonight, Commissioner. Oh, Commissioner Josephson, please go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, for the sake of time, I think we should take some time to reflect on it, and then, like, when it comes to the next meeting, if we want to have more of, like, I would say, thought out, reflective comments on it.
Thank you, Commissioner Josephson. Anyone else? All right, looks like we will move on to the second line item under 5.1. We have section 4 draft done by Commissioner Williams. Commissioner Williams, you are up.
I hadn't expected that we were going to talk about this in detail. I know that the person to draft recommendations has been kind of waiting for the body to decide what it wanted to do.
Yeah, no, I didn't expect you to go into very much detail. I wanted to, if you don't mind, you don't have to, just kind of give us maybe an overview of what we have, and then allowing commissioners to go through it on their own as we come back to it is what I was hoping for. But if that's something that you're not prepared for, and you would rather have us just go through this information and then come back to it, we can certainly do it that way. But I just thought I'd give you a moment to kind of chime in on your summary in regards to what that says.
Well, I made a first rough draft of the recommendation sections. That we have not discussed. I guess I anticipated that given our East Lansing's population and the size of its police force, we weren't likely to hire a full-time monitor. It cost $100,000 or $200,000 a year, and so looking around, I found the place that I thought might be useful to look at more closely was Albany, New York, and they have a complaint system where they have a board, a volunteer board, but on occasion, on a case-by-case basis, the board can hire investigators to look into a particular incident. So they have a panel of investigators that's available, so they can pick an investigator on a case-by-case basis. That was the Albany system. Their population is not quite twice as much as the East Lansing population. And I also put in several references in the thing that I wrote up to our impact on policy of the police department, and trying to not be a prisoner of the disciplinary system entirely. But it's there. It kind of covers the waterfront, and I hope people will look at it and see what they like, what they don't like, and it's intended as something to start the discussion.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. Did any other commissioners have response comments in regards to what they got so far? Yes, Commissioner Harrell, please go ahead.
I will just say that Albany is a pretty apt comparison. That's where I did my master's, so I spent 2 years in Albany. And Rob Wooden, who helped design the process for Albany, was one of my professors, is a colleague now. And just in terms of what the relationship is, for example, between Albany as the capital and having a major university there, the relationship between those three elements, I think is a pretty strong match for, despite the difference in size, a pretty strong match for what things look like in East Lansing. And I think there are a lot of useful data points to take away from what Albany has done. So I was both surprised and excited to see that Eric had gone down that road. But if commissioners have not read through the whole thing, I would just encourage you to think of things in that context. That don't be put off by this idea that Albany is drastically different from East Lansing in a number of ways. Surprisingly similar.
Thank you, Commissioner Rowe. Anyone else? Again, and I respect that we as a whole have not went through this substantial amount of work by Commissioner Williams and Commissioner Callwood, and so but we will kind of go into more of this discussion. This will be kind of where we'll be at the next time we kind of come in and do our thing. So it'll be very important to find the time to go through this and be able to have a weigh in the discussion as far as what our recommendations will be to the drafters and to the commission. Sound fair? Yes, Commissioner Boyle, go ahead.
Well, I think it's a great piece of work. I mean, as a beginning for the whole process, I think it's a great piece of work. But now that I hear that Commissioner Rowe has some experience with Albany, I wonder if he could reach out to them and see if there are things about their procedure that they might recommend tweaking. So we have that information in working with our own proposal.
Commissioner Rowe?
I don't know how involved Rob Gordon is in what the process currently looks like, but I'd be happy to reach out to him and pick his brain.
Thank you. Vice Chair Root.
Kathy, one of the things that earlier on in our process, we had this subcommittee on non-comparable cities, and Eric did a memo that I'll shoot over to you after the meeting with some documentation about Albany. And one of the things that it includes is a fairly recent evaluation. And it's very interesting. So they've been at this for like 20 years, but we do have access to some information that's quite recent. And that's, asking tough questions about it.
Thank you.
Other people might be interested in sort of re-looking at that as well now that the cat's out of the bag that Eric is thinking that's a really good model. Maybe we could just attach it to next week's agenda.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my You took the words right out of my mouth. I think that'd be helpful, so we don't have to go back and try to find it. Anyone else have any comments or reactions to the discussion? Yes, Commissioner Boyle.
Again, since I do here, more procedurally, as we start going through the recommendations in section 4, we may focus what we're going to discuss in each meeting. There's a complaint process, there's a composition of the commission, there's several use of FOIA. There's several topics that might be worthy of some more in-depth discussion, and if we kind of divvy them up in meetings, it would help us focus on those issues.
Yes, Commissioner Boyle, I was talking to the vice chair, and that's exactly what we want to do, so we can kind of narrow it down, such as so broad. And I think what we're going to come up with is a format for us to have that and send it out to everyone. And if anyone has any comments or anything like that, we can kind of modify that in a way that everyone's comfortable with. Is that fair to say, Vice Chair?
Yeah, I think our plan tonight, we didn't know how much time we have because of the other agenda items,
you know, the complaints one is going to be the really big one. There's just a lot of details. So we started last time with something, there were several things that weren't too complex. Now we're really going to get into the complicated one. And then we will have done some really, really significant work. And Eric did us a favor that he wrote after his long draft, he wrote about 4 pages, which is up front at the beginning, which is specifically about the complaints process. It's kind of pulling together things from the complaints process from the long one. So if people can get and really, you know, like read through those first 4 pages a couple times, that will really help to participate in the conversation in 2 weeks. And I think tonight was our last time with the presentation. So it will be entirely different. We'll have more time to really get in depth on the substantive recommendations, which will be a new experience, which, you know, I think we're ready for it. So anticipating that we're going to really delve into the complaint review process and the composition next time.
Thank you, Vice Chair. And so that's kind of what I was talking about in that, but she went ahead and just crushed it right there. So please be prepared, be ready, and it'll make these meetings a lot more smoother if you're doing those things as you guys know. So I'll go ahead and leave it at that, unless anyone had any more comments or reactions to that plan. All right, we'll go ahead and move on. The final line item on 5.1 kind of really is a wrap up of what we talked about our last meeting. And thank you, Vice Chair, for getting that, because we're gonna have to go back and look at all the stuff that we're talking about. And then, so this is, I just want to say personally, thank you for the tremendous amount of work that you're doing. No one's looking to help keep myself and the commission kind of somewhat organized when it comes to being able to go back and have this stuff to be able to use as reference points and data for our final report. So thank you for that. Did anyone have any questions for that final line item of what she has submitted for us, Vice Chair? All right, we'll go ahead and move on to, excuse me, in long meeting. All right, 5.2, follow-up questions needed for the study committee report, Council 2 report by Deputy Chief Gonzalez. We kind of have covered some of it already and just briefly talked about that. Did anyone have any more to that specific part of the follow-up questions that we have not discussed already in regards to the answers? Okay. Deputy Chief Gonzalez and Chief Johnson and City Manager Lahannas, thank you for entertaining us with that information and that data. We really, I feel like we all have grown from that specific information, those questions that were asked, and was very, very helpful. So we appreciate you doing that work for us and providing that to us. All right, I'll go ahead and move on to item 5.3, community meeting plan. Vice Chair Root, Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison, and myself had a nice meeting. I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Commissioner Ellsworth Etchison. Thank you.
So we're at the place, approaching the place where we get community, we want to get community feedback on our process and what they think of all of this. And so, as Commissioner Grigsby said, we had a meeting. All 3 of us have formulated some questions. We talked about the format. And obviously, we're going to still be virtual. And then utilizing the breakout sessions where we can get people into as if we were in person. We're going to have a conversation at the table with the table mates. And so we'll have a very structured process to kind of keep things moving along. With those questions. So we got a nice pool. We'll probably think of a few more, and then we'll have to do the hard part, narrowing down the questions. The date that we're looking at, so Commissioner Root looked at the schedule of the other meetings that take place within the city of East Lansing in the evening. And so it looks like we're landing on the date of March 2nd. That seems to be free of any other meetings at 7 p.m. to have this. And obviously, we're going to need help from the city to promote this. So one of the things that we discussed in our meeting is probably taking it more than just doing a Facebook or social media post, but maybe creating also a Facebook invite that we can all share over and over again. And the things that's nice about the Facebook invite is that you can, as you share to your page, you can click on invite. I mean, you can do this even without sharing it to your page, but and then start to like invite people. So we're going to need, we want to have a good representation. We want to get community feedback. And so we want to really leverage this awesome medium that we have, that we can use, which is social media. And so, but that's really in a nutshell where we're at right now. And if there's anything else I might have missed, Commissioner Root or Grigsby, please chime in. But that's really the crux of what we spoke about in our meeting.
Did you have anything to add, Vice Chair? You're mute.
Excellent. March 2nd is a Tuesday, and it's a Tuesday when the city council is not meeting. So we didn't find any other city meeting that night. It would be great if we could make a decision on that date today, and then we can, we'll have something to plan around. So I wonder if anybody has any information about why that might not be a good day, or whether if a whole bunch of us couldn't make it, that would make it not good.
Yes, Elaine Hardy, please go ahead.
This may not interfere with your process, but the library, along with the MLK Commission and the Lansing Chamber, is going to be hosting a community conversation with Dr. Loretta Ross on calling in culture, and that's scheduled for March 2nd in the evening. So just
That's not good. Well, I did not know that. That's why we bring this forward on the MLK Commission. Oh, that must be live, like just happened because I didn't know that.
Yeah, so we got to come up with something because we need time to get this thing promoted and discussed. And I mean, I don't know how much of a wrench that puts into us trying to find another time frame and get set up. But please, Elaine, please go ahead.
There could be some option. I'm not sure how long the group is interested in hosting kind of, but we have some wiggle time with Dr. Ross. We can do something from 7 to 8 with her. So there may be some option to do something different. I just know that both of those times are they're premium times.
No, we appreciate that. That's something that we could possibly work with. So what do you?
The other thing.
Go ahead, please.
Sorry. The other thing that we can consider. So when we were looking at this date, this March 2nd, we're still working on this, having everything wrapped up. I can't remember the exact date that we wanted to get this information to the council. What was that day? The 12th. So, very bad at that kind of thing. Like, so, look at pushing that date back a little bit. That April date to give us a little bit more flexibility we can bring, because it is going to be hard to pull a date in for the community conversation, but it's a necessary piece that we need. So that's another option out there.
Any more?
Remember Councilmember Bacon, that was reminded last week, the Councilmember Bacon said, there's a possibility that we could go a little bit past that date. So I'm just putting that out there as we're trying to find a date for the community conversation.
I don't support that, Kelly. Pushing.
You will or you don't?
I do not keep pushing.
Well, there's not a whole lot. We're going to be really limited when we're talking about a date now to bring in the community. Because remember, we're going to have to also, we don't want to go through the motions of getting the community input, because we're going to need to also be able to put that information into our plan. And so, if that March 2nd date doesn't work.
Yes, City Manager Lahanas.
It seems like a Tuesday without a council meeting is a great opportunity, so perhaps seven, we still could use that to lose. Our schedule is other nights. It's not easy to find, so maybe if there's some events, we can still go with the second and just try to set them at different times and get people to one event first for 7, and then time to get into our event is 7 or 7:15, even 7:30. Maybe we start at 5:30 and go until 7. And then people can do the event from the MLK from 7 to 8. I don't know how long your conversation would take. Is it an hour? Is it more? But I would hate to try to lose an open night like that, which may not be easy to come by.
Elaine, is your whole program designed to be an hour, or was it going to be longer? Were you talking about just a component?
It's scheduled for 1 hour.
It's scheduled for 1 hour.
Yes.
Well, and there's 3 of us in this meeting right here tonight that's part of the MLK Commission.
Oh, I know. We can't have them right up against each other. Yeah. Well, if it were possible for you to do 6 to 7, because I think we need at least an hour and a half. That's what we were thinking. We certainly wouldn't want to go longer than 2 hours, but I think we would need an hour and a half to give people some kind of background about what we're doing, and then have time to hear from them.
Unlike George's 5:30 I like George's splitting the difference, that you guys start at 5:30 and then you go at 7. I think either of those times are difficult.
I think 5:30 is going to be really tough to get people. Really tough.
Yeah, with people working.
Yeah. I mean, if
so, could Elaine's event go 6 to 7, and then we could go from 7:30 till 9? We used to start council meetings at 7:30, so that was kind of normal for us, starting at 7:30. Not perfect, but.
So did you get a lot of public attendance at those at 7:30? Because that's what we're talking about right here. We're not talking about our schedule necessarily, but the method.
Based on the topic, just like anything else.
Yeah. Okay. We can put it out there, 7:30.
So we're thinking 7:30 then. Kind of is what we have an idea about. Does anyone have any other comments about 7:30? I know it's late, and I know that we're trying to make this work with another conflict, but I agree with the city manager in regards to a rare moment of having that slot with everything else going on. I'm not opposed to the April timeline being moved, but I think I'm definitely in the minority with that as far as working with that. But so is anyone against 7:30 and kind of what we were thinking to do this for?
And I just want to also, Chairman, there may be some ways in which we can work to capture community comments prior to the conversation. So we can open up kind of a forum where we can have people send their comments or questions or whatever into that forum, so we can start the conversation in advance of our second day. So that's an option for us as well. I will work with my committee and see what we can do about
Thank you. Any other comments? Thank you. I appreciate that. I didn't even think about something like that as an option. That's very helpful. Any other comments? Because if I understand it correctly, because it is on a Tuesday night and we are doing a different time, and we're going to have to actually vote on that because it's outside of our regular timeline and what we've committed to. Is that correct? City Manager?
Yeah, I think there's certainly.
Oh, okay. So can you, Commissioner Ellsworth Edgerton or Vice Chair Root, go ahead and make that motion officially for us?
I move that we schedule a meeting of the study committee to get community input on the proposals for an oversight commission to be held March 2nd, Tuesday from 7:30 to 9 on Zoom.
Is there a second?
Yes, I second that.
Seconded by Commissioner Ellsworth Edgerton. Is there any discussion in regards to those details of that motion? All right. All those in favor, please say aye. Is there anyone opposed? All right, so moved. That's what we got going on, so we can really start our campaign in regards to that. I'm really excited. I was very, I didn't know how we were going to pull it off. I really didn't, and I'm so happy that we kind of have people in play now with that. So, any more discussion, Commissioner Ellsworth Edgerton, on your presentation with that? We good to go? Okay.
I'm good.
All right, sounds good. Item 5.4 is just there because it is old business. Unless someone had something they wanted to add to section 2, it's just going to sit there. We don't have to really discuss that unless Vice Chair Root had something to say to it. Okay, and that's part of what I had said previous of the work we're doing and how that will come into play as we go forward. So we want to keep that in motion there. All right. Item point 6 or 6 point item 6, excuse me. Commissioner announcements, any comments, concerns, or anything like that that someone wants to get out? Yes, Commissioner Harrell.
I'd just like to encourage everybody in our voluminous free time, if you've not done so already, to pick up or peruse a copy of The End of Policing by Alex Vitale. It's a book that is sort of roughly analogous to the Defend the Police movement, right? It's not, despite the title, abolish the police book, but it is more about this historical perspective of where policing came from and sort of why we wound up where we are in terms of seeing these same consistent concerns come up again and again and again. It's a book that I generally assign to my juniors and seniors, so I would hope that it would be something that we can all handle. Just at the top of my reading list.
Thank you, Commissioner Rowe. Appreciative of that. Anyone else? I just had real quick off-the-wall question for Chief Justice Deputy Gonzalez. I had a community member ask me about the social workers. And just kind of how right now you guys are determining when they respond to what calls and how that process works. And she had asked me that, and I was like, I'm not sure. It's a good question. Could you speak to that just real quick, by chance?
Yes. The everyone listens to the radio calls. So if there's a call that comes across the radio that one of our social workers are, and they're on duty, and they hear a call that they think they can help, they would actually ask the dispatch to go on that same call, and they will follow the officer to the call. The officer will make sure the scene is safe and things like that. The social worker would be there and help intervene and help deal with whatever crisis is going on at the time. And then they'll do a referral, and they'll engage the party who may need their assistance, and they do work at the time, and then they do any possible referrals that will come up later on. And then the social workers will go ahead and do the follow-up work on those referrals. So they'll go ahead and get the referrals set up, and they'll go back on their own sometimes and follow with the citizen later on, depending on what the case is and things like that. So it's basically an all hands on deck type of situation. When we hear a call that we think social worker can help, we ask the social worker to go. Most of the time, the social workers listen to the radio also, and they actually go ahead and take that call to themselves. But they very, very rarely. I have haven't seen a case because the chief may know, but we haven't sent any social workers to an original call without a police officer yet. Just because of this whole safety issue thing, they're trying to make sure everyone's safe. But I have not heard of a call where they just went on a call by themselves, a fresh call. They go and do follow-up work, but not necessarily a fresh call. They'll go with the officer.
Okay. Now, are they just at the station, or are they riding along, or is it a mixture of both? How's it set up?
Early on, it was a mixture of both.
Okay.
They get a feel for the police and what they're doing and things like that. But they have their own car, and they have their own office, they have their own radio and all their gear and things like that. So they actually most of the time respond from the station, or if they're on a call, or if they're on a referral with a client and things like that, they'll just go from one client to another client. Our referral numbers are, I can't speak for the numbers, but we're close to 50 referrals since the end of November, which for 2 social workers, well, we don't know what our baseline is. So we think it's a lot. Social workers are extremely happy with the work that they're doing and the impact that they're making. And so they're very engaged in the clients they're dealing with. And a lot of the clients, it's a patient client situation. So we don't see a lot of the clients dealing with their situations from this confidentiality standpoint. So they're logging all their work. We'll be getting a monthly report from them at the end of the month to see what they've been doing during the month. So we can capture it a little bit tighter for everyone to see what they're doing. And they're excited about their work.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I personally have heard nothing but great things about what they're doing, the impact they're making already on some of the different areas of the districts, I think is how you would call it. We can't have enough of them, can we, in regards to that? My other question is kind of a more serious one, because there's 2 sets of information out there, and I just don't know. For the head stabilization technique, I had one set of information saying that that's no longer going to be practiced within the East Lansing Police Department. And then I had another report saying that it's used only in special situations. So I just want to get the official understanding of the head stabilization and the way that we see it as a community. Is that something that's still utilized with the use of force, or is it out? Like, where are we at with that particular procedure?
So the way our policy addresses head stabilization is it essentially does not allow head stabilization as a means of subject to control. So you cannot control someone's head just to control the individual. There are 2 instances where head stabilization would be used or would be authorized. The first one is through PPCT, or pressure point control. And there are a couple pressure points on the head. There's one behind the ear, or at the jaw line here, called a mandibular angle. There's a one right underneath the nose that's called the infraorbital. And officers learn this technique in the police academy, and are trained on it throughout their career, or have to recertify, if you will, on it throughout their career. In order to properly apply those 2 pressure points, you have to apply counter pressure, because if you push here and someone's head goes this way, the pressure point it's not going to work. So you have to apply counter pressure to the head for the pressure point to work. The second instance would be if the head is the appendage. So if someone is trying to headbutt you, you can protect yourself and block them from trying to headbutt you. So those are the two instances where touching someone's head would be acceptable under our current policy. But again, I want to reiterate that the head stabilization as a means of pure subject control, that is not allowed under our policy as it's written today.
Okay. All right. All right. Thank you. Thank you for that. And that's all I had in regards to that. Any other announcements or statements from any of the commissioners? All right. We are at item number 7 for adjournment. I would look for a motion for us to adjourn this evening. I just want to say thank you, staff, in advance for being here in your time. and also the commissioners as well for your time and input tonight. Is there a motion for adjournment tonight? Moved by Commissioner Josephson. Is there a second? Seconded by Commissioner Garcia Jr. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Good night, everyone. Thank you so much. Let's knock out section 4, please. Let's look at it. Let's do our thing. Take care.
Thank you.
Good night. All right, we got the meeting wrapped up tonight. Thank you. It's a long meeting. What are we at? We're at 2 hours and 40 minutes. Thank you guys. Thank you guys and gals, and appreciate you. I hope something you got out of this to help you in your community, or your project or your research that we're doing here that is helpful. And please tune in for our next meeting. Take care.